further ado, Fuller Runyan, the property manager at the Harrisburg State Hospital and a longtime friend of Historic Harrisburg Association.
Thank you, David. Thank you to Historic Harrisburg for asking me to do this. And thank you to Joanna for hooking me up and making everything work. And thank you all for coming out. I hope you don't think I'm rude. I'm going to sit with, I'm going to face the images along with you. I'm going to talk. I'm going to have a little bit of help with a speaker, so that should help the folks in the back. If you have trouble here, please let me know. I'm not a historian. I'm basically going to do a slideshow of things that I found over the years that I thought were interesting and kind of describe them to you. And at the end, if there's time and if there's questions, I'll take some questions. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm a native of Milton, PA. Some of you probably know where that is. Our claim to fame is we were the home of Chef Boyardee. Chef Boyardee products are still made there. I moved to Harrisburg in 1989, and I'm a 34-year employee of the Department of General Services. Currently, I'm the operations maintenance manager of what we call the DGS Annex Complex, part of which is the grounds and buildings of the old Harrisburg State Hospital. I've been at this post for 7.5 years after 10 years overseeing the official residence of the Lieutenant Governor out at Fort Indian Town Gap. And for 16 years before that, I directed the public events at the State Capitol Complex, including activities at the Forum. So tonight I'm going to talk about the history of the Harrisburg State Hospital, known until 1921 as the Pennsylvania State Lunatic Hospital. And I'm going to do it in a way that you can see it as seen from the city of Harrisburg and surrounding communities. My sources for tonight include 2 books, City on the Hill by local Renaissance man Ernest Morrison, which was published in 1992. It's really the magnum opus of the subject. It's beautifully written, remarkably well researched, and has some interesting photographs. The second book is a wonderful photo album of sorts called Harrisburg State Hospital, Pennsylvania's First Public Asylum, from the Images of America series by Arcadia Publishing. And this book was compiled, assembled, and written by Philip N. Thomas and published in 2013. Mr. Thomas's book is widely available. Amazon always has it, as does eBay. Mr. Morrison's book, on the other hand, is very hard to come by. I got my copy on eBay after searching for a couple of years. Both are very much worth getting your hands on if you can. Another primary source has been newspapers.com. It's a fantastic website with more than 1 billion digitized newspaper pages available. It's all indexed and searchable, and highly addictive, I'll say. I spend way too much time on there, but it's fun. All the articles I'm using tonight are from Pennsylvania newspapers, and I think I remember where they're from. Hopefully I won't mess it up, but I'll try to tell you what papers they're from. Some of the images tonight have been found on the internet without attribution. And I also I have a printed source page available if anybody wants a copy. It's up on the table in the front of the room. And it'll, if you want to continue your study on the subject. And if we run out of handouts, we'll figure out something. We'll get one to you. And some of the images I found hanging outside my office. My predecessor, Bill Richards, a longtime member of Historic Harrisburg, left a wonderful collection of framed photographs that he found through the years. A lot of times he found them in the empty buildings and things like that. Others people had given to him, but some of these pictures are fabulous. Before I start, a little disclaimer. Any comments or opinions I may happen to share are solely my own and not necessarily of my employer or of our host tonight. I am not a clinician nor a professional historian, but rather a mere property professional who tends to take a deep interest in the buildings and grounds in my portfolio and loves to share what I found. Most of this will be in chronological order. Every now and then I might skip out just to provide texture or context. So yes, I'll go off on tangents, but hopefully it'll lead to a better understanding of events. The story of the asylum at Harrisburg begins with Dorothea Lynn Dix and her memorial soliciting a state hospital for the insane. Memorial in those days was a written plea to the General Assembly of the state that she was presenting to, in this case, of course, Pennsylvania. And this one was to fill the void in treating the poor and indigent mentally ill. Okay, and in my page of sources, there's a link to read this entire thing. and I would highly encourage it if you're interested in such things. It's incredibly well written, and there's some really interesting stories. To get to one of the poorhouses, she had to whitewater raft, and she did a lot of it by horseback, and it's kind of a snapshot into the time, and it's also a testament to Dorothea Dix. Now, a lot of history buffs will remember that name. She was famous for assembling the nursing corps for the United States Army in the Civil War, and of course the work that she did for the mentally ill came before that. Pennsylvania was the third state to receive her reporting after Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Her methods were astonishing and brilliantly effective. She visited every poorhouse, almshouse, and jail in every county in the state, and then reported on them and on the conditions that she found. So this is a line from the book that really jumped out at me. This subject comes home to everyone. On this ground all alike may suffer, the rich and the poor, the learned and the uneducated, the young, the mature, and the aged. From this malady none are sure of exemption, and the often reverses of fortune teach that none are so prosperous that they may not use to share the asylum which solicited now to shelter others. So that's a good point. I think we still have this problem in our society today. People don't focus in on a problem unless it affects them or people close to them, and sometimes you need somebody to go before the powers that be and then point out a need that they might not otherwise see. This is a page from it, just talking about Somerset County. Down there they kept them in the jail, and sometimes they didn't get fed. It's just a very terrible situation that she was addressing. The General Assembly acted with astonishing speed. Her presentation was read on February 3rd, and a bill was reported out of committee on March 8th. The bill was passed and signed by Governor Shunk on April 14th. So anybody that's been involved in the state government knows that really is unusual, even for that time. The commission established by the act published its first report in January of 1846. In the report, they disclosed that they had purchased a farm within 1.5 miles of Harrisburg of about 130 acres. And in the snippet here, they talk about, it had plentiful water, and it was just a perfect site. It was actually their second choice. They wanted a farm that would be close to what is now Interstate 81. But the person who owned it passed away, and his estate sold it to someone else before they could make the purchase. But I think they lucked out there because the site of the hospital really was perfect. In July 1848, it was announced that John Haviland, a renowned Philadelphia architect, was procured for the design of the building, which would be 500 feet in length. If you're wondering, the current Capitol building in Harrisburg is 520 feet long, just to give you a little. They added on to that later, making it a total of 700 feet. That's a big building. This image hangs in my office suite. It's a plat map of the farm with the asylum building superimposed. The name the guy that owned that other land that they didn't get, he's kind of famous in Pennsylvania history, Jacob Ridgway. The site was known as Spruce Run Farm, and it had been surveyed by the former owner, John Sale, in 1844. Mr. Sale was an Irish-born farmer whose land stretched from East Harrisburg up to about Elmerton now, including what is now the Harrisburg Cemetery was part of that. Mr. Sale passed in 1850, and his widow, Harriet Sales, lived at their homestead at 13th and Jonestown Road into the 1880s. By the time of this blurb in February 1851, the commission's work was winding down. This is from the Pittsburgh Daily Press, February 12, 1851. The building was nearing completion, and a board of trustees and superintendent had been chosen. The first superintendent was Dr. John Kerwin, a protege of Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, who ran the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in West Philadelphia. I'll talk more about Dr. Kirkbride in a minute. Dr. Kerwin would remain in his post until January of 1881. After Harrisburg, he went on to lead Pennsylvania mental health facilities in Warren, followed by Danville, and finally Dixmont in Allegheny County. So all told, he ran mental facilities for 50 years at the time of his retirement. When he was all done, he came back to Harrisburg, where he passed away in 1901. This is the earliest known image of the Pennsylvania State Lunatic Hospital. It's an etching by Thomas Sinclair, and it appears as the frontispiece for the bylaws of the Pennsylvania State Lunatic Asylum at Harrisburg, with the acts of the legislature establishing the same. The building was based on the philosophy of Dr. Kirkbride, who I mentioned earlier, who eventually wrote a book about it, which he laid out specifically how you build a mental hospital, and it would complete with floor plans, what type of care would occur on the different levels and sections, even down to what kind of heat you should use for it. The building was shaped in such a way as to maximize sunlight and moving air. The heating plant was to the rear of the building in the laundry and storage building, along with the bakery and later a fan room for the warmer months. This style of building dominated the mental health field for decades. There are some still standing. If you get the chance to visit Danville State Hospital, their Kirkbride building is still in use. One reason we have so much knowledge about the early decades of the asylum is that John Kerwin kept a diary. This is the first page, which shows the facility opening on October 1st, 1851, and the receipt of the first patient, Mrs. Bishop, 5 days later. It's kind of a slog because it's in his hand, and it can be a little tricky, but it's definitely worth the read. I found several pages later that we learned that a Mr. Runyan had been taken home by his brothers. Now, I don't know who that was, obviously, but I can say that my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Joshua Runyan, had a brother who had mental health troubles, and eventually he took his own life by drinking laudanum. So it's very possible that that individual was my relative. One question I get a lot back when, in the tour days was anyone famous a patient here? And the answer is yes. One of America's greatest early poets and writers, Charles Fenno Hoffman, was a patient beginning in 1854. He was considered on the level of Longfellow, Washington Irving, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., people like that. And as his mental illness set in, his memory was stuck in that time. And over time, he would talk about things that happened years ago as if it just happened yesterday. If any of you have seen that movie, 50 First Dates with Drew Barrymore, where every day she picks up where she left off on a certain date, it's likened to that, kind of a similar situation. Mr. Hoffman passed away at Harrisburg State Hospital on June 7th, 1884, after 30 years as a patient, and he was buried in his hometown in Philadelphia. So, a little tangent here. I read where when he first came to Harrisburg as a patient, he was well enough that he could go into town to get a cup of coffee or do things that anyone can do. But then as time wore on, as he started to age and started to become infirm and such, I think that's when the real mental illness set in, and then he was pretty much he couldn't move around, he couldn't leave. Another frequent question is, did a president of the United States ever visit Harrisburg State Hospital? And on this page of Dr. Kerwin's diary, we learned that on September 27th, 1855, President Franklin Pierce visited. The president came to Harrisburg to attend a large agricultural fair. So last time I gave this presentation, I didn't know where that was, but the fairgrounds was where Camp Curtin later was. So that was interesting. So I wonder if maybe he was at this fair and looked up on the hill and saw the building and said, hey, what's that? Maybe, right? Yeah. But it's also equally possible that he wanted to visit it because his wife, First Lady Jane Pierce, suffered from depression. A lot of people don't know this. This is one of those historical facts that gets lost. But between the election and the inauguration of President Pierce, they were in a horrible train accident where the train upset, and their beloved son was killed in that accident. And Mrs. Pierce wore black. She was in mourning pretty much the entirety of Franklin Pierce's presidency. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen this. This is a beautiful bird's eye view of Harrisburg. Yeah, you can get this anywhere as a poster. You can get it on canvas. It's really beautiful. The reason I have it on here today. The reason I'm showing it is there twice on this beautiful image you see the Harrisburg Lunatic Hospital. Okay, so up at the top you see this one, And I really like this image because it shows the two red cottages at the front of campus. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the plans for the property, but I can tell you that those two red cottages are part of the plans. They will be restored and will continue to be used. So those cottages were built, we think, in 1853, and we know from documents that Dorothea Dix paid for them herself. So the state hospital, when it was a large building such as the one you see here, the male wards were to the left or to the north, and then the female wards were to the right or to the south. And that continued on when they went to the smaller buildings. So the small cottage on the left, that was the male library, and then the cottage to the right was the female library. And here's the scene from the bottom of the print, and you may have seen this before too. I like to joke this looks like it was taken from the South Bridge, but of course that was 100+ years in the future. But you can see up in the corner, there's the Harrisburg State Hospital. So the hospital was clearly seen from just about anywhere in the city. I read one account where they said you could see it from Enola. So currently there's like a real good tree cover that goes in front of the buildings, and it kind of hides it away. I tell people all the time, I lived here 10 years before I even knew that it was there. It was, you know, I just didn't know. And this is, I'm sure many of you have seen this one before too. It's from Harper's Weekly, and it shows Camp Curtin, okay? And off in the distance is the Harrisburg State Lunatic Hospital. One of the things that happens a lot up there is people walking around with metal detectors, and as often as not, they're looking for relics from Camp Curtin because they read somewhere that it was on or near the state hospital. But I point out that the farm show itself is on state hospital ground. So you know, you're not going to find any bullet shells or casings or whatever up on the hill. But if they didn't have pavement everywhere, you might as well find it down by the farm show. But I did also read that during the Camp Curtin days that sometimes soldiers would go up the hill to get a bath or a cup of coffee. So this is the only known photograph of the entire original hospital. I found this while bebopping around the J. Paul Getty Museum site. The photo was made by sometime in the 1870s, we think, by a man named William Purviance, who took pictures for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And I can't remember what they're called, but some of you have seen them. It's where you have the two images and you look at it through a viewer. So thank you. So what you can see in this picture is you see the fence along the railroad at the bottom. You can sort of make out the canal, which ran right by there, and then of course the creek, the Paxton Creek that went there. So I'm guessing that this image, just judging by where the hospital is, this image probably lines up pretty close to McClay Street. And then, of course, in the picture you see those two cottages that are still there. So this little blurb taken from Selinsgrove Times Tribune, January 12th, 1881. So we learn that after 30 years at the helm, Dr. Corwin has not been reelected, but rather is replaced with his second in command, Dr. Jerome Gerhardt. No word on why, but apparently there were some rumblings that some things weren't copacetic and they decided to make a change. What's interesting is just a couple weeks later, they're doing the appropriations hearing, and Corwin had already testified on behalf of his new post, Warren State Hospital, but was invited by members of the General Assembly to hang around for the Harrisburg discussion. And he contradicted one of the trustees, and that was not appreciated. That did not go well. The topic was, if you can see that, was whether they needed to do anything about the water, and Corwin didn't think so. But they went ahead and dug a well almost 1,000 feet deep. There are now two wells almost 1,000 feet deep, and you can see them along the green belt down in that area. They look like two mounds. And then there's a little patio looking thing across the roadway. That was actually the base of a building. That was the pump house. So the water was taken from those wells, pumped up into a 100,000 gallon tank at the top of what we now call the laundry building. And then water was fed to the campus by gravity. And I'm sure many of you have seen this fantastic bird's eye by J.R. Fender from 1881. There's a lot of really neat stuff to see on this. You know, the reservoir next to the old Capitol. The house that I currently live in is on this image. But pertinent to today's discussion, up top there you see the Harrisburg State Lunatic Hospital. This is an interesting story that Ernie Morrison talked about in his book. In August of 1885, it was learned that a woman named Addison Brinkle, I think it was her real name, her full name, she had been a patient at Harrisburg for over 27 years, and she was not mentally ill. What happened was she had been committed by her father, a physician, along with a friend of his who was a judge, because she had run up a bunch of debt and then sold some of the items for which she had assumed the debt. So they felt at the time that the safest thing to do for her was to put her in a mental institution. Then she wouldn't be prosecuted and put in jail and bring you know, embarrassment and so forth. 27 years. And of course the public was horrified and justly outraged. How they discovered it was they interviewed some of the patients, and that's how it came out. That's how it actually was exposed. So this image, dated 1890, is a Sanborn fire insurance map, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these. These are fantastic tools for genealogists and historians alike. So these were designed to, I'm quoting the Library of Congress, assist fire insurance agents in determining the degree of hazard associated with a particular property, and therefore show the size, shape, and construction of dwellings, commercial buildings, and factories, as well as firewalls, locations of windows and doors, sprinkler systems, and types of roofs. You know, like the buildings in pink are brick, the blue are stone or concrete, and the yellow ones are frame. Buildings in brown are considered to be fire-resistive construction. Now here on this image, we can see the original building, right? And then you can see at the top and the bottom are what they called the branch buildings. So you have the male branch building at the top, the female at the bottom. And just below the female branch building, you can see the laundry building, which still stands. So these buildings became necessary because of a recurring problem at Harrisburg Hospital, overcrowding. And these allowed them to take in more than 300 additional patients. Okay, time for, this is a serious issue, but here's a little levity. This caught my eye, and it's something that every golfer can chuckle about. Dr. William Wright, who had been first assistant to Superintendent Dr. Henry Orth, had traveled abroad to study and showed up upon his return with a set of golf clubs and boxes of golf balls, having learned the sport while in Scotland. Credited with introducing the game to Harrisburg in 1893, he usually played by himself at the hospital and remembered that people would pass by saying things like, "Look at that poor fellow, I presume he does that all day. I guess that's why he's here." Also in 1893, how's that for a segue? Philadelphia architect Addison Hutton was hired to rebuild the hospital in the cottage plan. I think I might have referenced that earlier. Meaning a smaller set of 2- and 3-story buildings arrayed in a symmetrical pattern with distance in between, as opposed to having everything in one or several large buildings. The first building up was the administration building, which was completed in 1895. The building was faced with Steelton brick and Hummelstown brownstone. This building was built to replace the center portion of the original Kirkbride building, which had begun to fall apart and had been condemned. In the background to the left of the postcard image, you can see remnants of the Kirkbride, which remained for several years. This building also will be included in the new laboratory facility. This page of a 1901 map from a Harrisburg City Directory shows the admin building in front of the Kirkbride, but it also shows to the right, it shows the Department for the Chronic Insane, and we can start to see this cottage plan taking shape. That Chronic Insane building, we call that Willow Oak now, that still stands, and they added a building just to the west of it that's exactly the same size that for many years housed the state government computer system, the server farm. This image was posted on a Harrisburg History Facebook page, And others remarked about the old Pembroke barn and the schoolhouse that's now apartments. Others looked at the top of the frame, saw the Rockville Bridge. That's pretty cool, right? But what caught my eye was, there is the chronic insane building. So you could even see the back of campus from the rest of Harrisburg in those days. This 1922 aerial photograph, we can see what transpired over the next several years, a construction frenzy, which included a central kitchen and cold storage, a morgue, male and female wards, nurses' homes, a solarium, and a chapel. This flurry of building occurred almost entirely under the watchful eye of Superintendent Dr. Henry Orth, who ran the hospital from 1891 until his retirement in 1917. Here's a clear aerial a few years later by Colonel Victor Dallin. Some of you might be familiar with his work. And this image is really beautiful. I left a link to this one too. If you go to the Hagley Museum Digital Archives, Hagley Museum, of course, is the DuPont Family Museum in Delaware. The images they have from the Dallin collection are astonishingly clear. They're just amazing to look at. Now, if you look in the upper left center of this image, you'll see something very interesting. At center top, you are looking at the original hospital cemetery. In this picture, it's situated on top of a weird mesa-like plot because as the hospital grew eastward, they graded it so that the whole thing would be flat at the same level. And by the time they got out to where the cemetery was, of course you can't grade through a cemetery, right? No. So they went around it. Now let me tell you a little bit about that cemetery. There's a Susquehanna Township map from 1870 that has the cemetery on it. And when they put that cemetery there, it was in the middle of the woods. And then of course, as the campus grew on this cottage plan, they kind of caught up to that space and exposed it in the way that you see here. But not to worry. After looking at it for 27 years, Dauphin County Court gave the go-ahead to relocate the cemetery. So the 230 bodies and 9 headstones were moved up on top of the hill opposite the morgue. When there's a light snow, you can actually see the cart path that goes up the side of the hill up to where that cemetery is now. And of course, the cemetery is very close to Arsenal Boulevard, which of course did not exist at that time. This is actually the legal notice instructing them to recreate this cemetery at a different location. So they put it back in the woods, in other words, but just different woods. And some of you may have seen this one, and you may be familiar with the man who made this picture, Samuel Cunert. This will actually show, if you look at the top of the image, you'll see the building that they put right where the cemetery had been before. We call it Hemlock, and for many years that was the Catholic Charities homeless shelter. So we date this at about 1929, this picture. And if you look down in the lower right corner, you can see the headstones of the current cemetery.
No, where are the 2 cottages that were added in front of the original building?
In this image, you can barely make out the female one, and then of course the male one's off, just out of frame to the left. So this is the Sanborn fire map for 1929, and this really shows the cottage plan at its peak. Again, the pink buildings are brick, the brown are fire resistive, and the yellow are frame buildings. So you can see those buildings in the front to the left of the image. Those are the ones that we're keeping, as well as the chapel. A recurring problem throughout the history of the hospital has been overcrowding. In 1937, all of the Pennsylvania mental institutions were ordered to stop accepting patients. I imagine that was quite a dilemma, right? And of course, the cure was a building program. So in 1938, through the federal WPA, they started building more structures. What you're looking at here, you see the tuberculosis building, which we call Hilltop now. To the right of that, you see the new kitchen, which is still there. And then in the center, at the bottom, at the top of the bottom part, is the power plant, which still stands. And then at the bottom are the 2 brick physician cottages, which were built next to the gatehouse, or the steward's cottage. Other than the maintenance building, no other structures have been built since 1963. I love this picture. This I found like a postage stamp size image on the Dauphin County Historical Society site. And I asked them if I could use it in this presentation, and they graciously let me do that. Any of the pictures that I have up tonight, I will share with you free of charge if you want, but not this one. This one you're going to have to go to Dauphin County and purchase it, because that's a big part of their program. But you can see what I think is really cool about this picture. This ran in the January 25th, 1938 Evening News, and the reason for the photo was to show just how terrible farm show traffic was. And apparently it worked, because 2 years later they built a brand new bridge, and that's the one that's there now, and they're getting ready to replace that one, right?
Yeah.
Which street is this?
McClay Street. So you're at the top of the McClay Street Bridge, looking down. The farm show's on the left.
Oh,
Okay. Now what I like about it is, as clear as a bell, you can see the admin building, and it kind of goes along with what I keep saying. The farm show was, or the farm show, the state hospital was so much part of the community, and I believe a large part of that was because you could see it. It was a building that was something that you could see, and I think that's why that was. Now this picture was made around the same time, and it shows how sparse the trees were again. But what I like about this one is it shows another it shows a CCC project, the stone steps that go down into the nature area from the front of admin. And you'll be happy to know that we're getting ready to spruce that up, and a local horticulturist club wants to get involved and keep that going, so we're very happy about that. Now I got to do a little baseball plug. I'm a big baseball guy. My team's in the World Series right now. They're not doing so good, but so this image is about Twilight baseball. I was a Twilight baseball coach for a few years. I would coach the Susquehanna Township team. But it turns out that the hospital had a team, and a very good one by all accounts, made up of patients and staff. On this date, they were led by lefty hurler and slugger Tuffy Hauser, beating Paxton 4-2 at a away game. That was a little bit of a surprise to me that they I just assumed they played all the games. Let me tell you how I found out they had a baseball team. So there's a softball field up on campus. It's behind the Willowa complex. And we let the local church league use it. And I was looking at an aerial photograph from Penn State Pilot website. And when I was looking at it, I'm like, that looks too big to be a softball field. That looks like a baseball field. And then I looked it up, and turns out it was a baseball field. In 1958, after the Department of Public Welfare took over from the trustees, Secretary Harry Shapiro banned hospital employees from living on site, saying it was inappropriate. I didn't mention this before, but up to this time, if you worked at the state hospital, chances were you lived there too. They actually had nurses' buildings. The building that was built where the cemetery was, that was for married attendants. So if you had a husband and wife that worked at the state hospital, they could live in that married attendant's cottage. So what we're going to see here for the rest of the way is kind of how this unraveled.
Excuse me, just a comment. At that time, they also housed the physicians, because I lived in one of those houses as a child.
That's right.
Growing up there.
The last physician to move out was Dr. Adair, and he lived in that Tudor-style house until 2021.
We were in those three houses closest to the farm show.
Down by Cameron Street,
Down
right?
by Cameron. So the third brick one furthest from Cameron
Okay.
was our home. And
Very
then
good.
another doctor in the middle and an
That-
administrator in the wooden siding house.
Did you recognize that on the image from
Oh,
the? Okay,
absolutely.
excellent, very
Yeah.
good. The last bill that President Kennedy ever signed in October 1963, it was a law designed to move mental health care out of the large institutions and move them back into the communities. The goal, now if you remember, President Kennedy had a sister who lived in an institution. So he was very keen and very mindful of the situation. The goal was to reduce the institutional population by half by 1973. So you could say that half of his vision occurred. They started winding down the large institutions, but the other half sadly did not occur. That being moving it into the communities and setting it up. And it was kind of a breakdown of different views as time went on. Of course, he didn't live to see any of it. Now, what happened after 10 years was that the federal courts ruled that hospital patients could no longer work at the facility or on its farms unless they were paid minimum wage. So that essentially ended patient labor. I think it was well intended, but I also think that occupational therapy is a thing, and maybe that was mixed blessing when they did that. But that also spelled problems for the system. I think I mentioned that Harrisburg State Hospital at its peak had 1,000 acres. Most of that was farmland. And what they tried to do, like other institutions, if you were a farmer in your life, you worked on the farm at the institution. If you were a bricklayer, they tried to line you up with your strengths. And I think it probably did do some good for a lot of people. But when they banned that or made it so that you had to pay them the minimum wage, it made it unsustainable. And that's when they started carving off land. That whole stretch along Elmerton Avenue was State Hospital farmland. So where you have the Pennsylvania State Police Headquarters, Game Commission, Fish Commission, PSECU, PEMA, all of that was State Hospital farmland. And we still own the land behind PEMA, but we're in negotiations to convey that to Susquehanna Township for a park. So we'll see how that goes. It's exciting. And then this article is basically about the end of the farms. It was just unsustainable. Harrisburg State Hospital had a stand at Broad Street Market. If they had a surplus of any of the things they made, butter, milk, they had a piggery, they had a chicken operation. The chicken barn, the foundation for that still exists. It's at Tech Park at the end. People often ask me what that is. One guy, he wanted to know if it was a fort. And I said, yeah, for chickens. He was disappointed. So I guess what I'm saying here is the hospitals became more and more expensive to run. By 1978, Harrisburg State Hospital was down to about 500 patients and about just as many staff. By the early 2000s, rumors began to circulate about closures. Now, I still have people and staff that worked at Harrisburg State Hospital when it was a hospital, and they never thought that they would close Harrisburg because it was the first one. But that's not the calculation that the state government used. What they tried to do is they tried to choose hospitals and towns that could withstand the economic blow of having a employer of 500 people suddenly no longer operate. And that's why they chose Harrisburg, because Harrisburg was best set up to withstand that blow. On January 27, 2006, the Harrisburg State Hospital ceased operations. Remaining 50 patients remained on site under the care of community organizations pending transfer. A lot of those people ended up at Danville, if you're wondering. Later that year, the Department of General Services took over operations and maintenance of the facility, which was still home to several offices of the Department of Public Welfare and other affiliated agencies, and the DGS Annex Complex was born. That's the source page. That's all I have for tonight. I hope you enjoyed the photos and listen to me go on and on about it. At this time, thank you. If anyone has any questions.
Any questions for Fuller?
Yes.
When did they change the name from lunatic hospital to state hospital?
Well, on newspapers.com you can see it clearly, 1921.
Because it seems like lunatic is not a very nice word, but I guess back then that people had mental issues, they were lunatics?
Well, you know how it is with language. A word can mean something for a time and then it becomes a negative. So they come up with a euphemistic replacement until that one becomes problematic. So I think that's probably what happened with lunatic and asylum. I will point out though that the creek down there is still called Asylum Run, which I think is pretty cool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Those were not negative terms
correct.
100 years ago. They became negative later on.
I also think that maybe in a way some of the mission had changed a little bit. I know toward the end there they had people with dementia, things of that nature, which might not necessarily be considered mental illness in the way that you would think of other things, schizophrenia, things like that. So I think their mission might have widened a little bit. So maybe that had something to do with it too. But it's interesting too. In Pennsylvania, we have all of our mental institutions are still called state hospitals, but then you also have Ashland State Hospital, which is not a mental institution. I think it's very confusing, and but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, the state general hospitals were separate from the state hospitals, which never used the term mental, but the general hospitals were in the coal regions, which had a high amount of accidents because the coal industry was so dangerous.
Right.
And yet the coal regions didn't have hospitals. They were, poor parts of Pennsylvania. So the state built general hospitals in Ashland and 5 or 6 of them in the hard coal regions of Pennsylvania. One by one, when it became kind of obsolete to need that, and of course they were not well run, and they were money losers and so forth. In fact, I knew a family that lived in Ashland, and they said, "Oh, we had neighbors that would check their children into the state hospital for the winter because it was warmer to live there, and they got free food."
Oh, my God. Wow.
Fuller,
Yes.
could you just go over which of the buildings are actually going to stay?
So we have plans for the admin building in the front of campus and those 2 cottages. The admin building will be support space for the lab. It'll be some office space, classrooms, conference rooms, things of that nature. The building's actually perfect for modern use. The rooms are large, the hallways are large, elevators large. It's just a blessing to have that building, be able to use that going forward. The 2 cottages, we're not entirely clear on what they're going to be used as, but one idea, which I think is a good one, is we got this idea from Penn State. They had a house on campus back by the Arboretum that they made into a crime lab. So what you do is all the surfaces inside the house are easily scrubbable, and then you can mimic blood spatter and bullet marks, and people can learn how to read evidence that way. So the one that's set up like a house, I think, would be used for that. And then the other one at the south, the ladies' library, that would be maybe retail crime lab, where police could practice intervening in a robbery or something along those lines. So that's exciting. The other building that we're so fortunate to be able to reuse is the chapel. Not only is the chapel just beautiful, but it's actually a very well-built building, and it's laid out very well for the modern use. And these 5 agencies that are in the lab project, I don't know if I told you who they were. It's DEP, Environmental Protection, Conservation National Resources, the Department of Health, Department of Agriculture, and then the Pennsylvania State Police. So this lab's going to be a godsend for these people. Right now, the state police are scattered all over Pennsylvania. And when they have to have evidence studied, they have to send it by courier, or it's very time consuming and costly. The Department of Health laboratory is in a pole building down off the turnpike down in southeastern Pennsylvania. It's so inadequate. When the pandemic broke out, they had to convert the cafeteria and kitchen into the COVID lab. So for these agencies, and DCNR, DEP are in leased space. Those labs are actually very nice. It's a nice building off of Interstate Drive. But I think the idea of having all these agencies in one spot and being able to work with each other and share resources and troubleshoot, I think it's really going to be a good thing. And maybe I'm being presumptuous here, but I feel like with the mission of the hospital to serve the public, and it will continue to do that. It will maybe a different mission, but it will still be in service of the public. So that's exciting.
So you're going to be building some new buildings?
Yeah, it's a 320,000 square foot lab building for the the 4 agencies that are not state police, and then the state police will get their own building. And keeping with the tradition, a hat tip to the original cottage plan, these buildings will mirror each other. They will be symmetrical, one facing the other. So that's kind of a continuation of the idea that Addison Hutton and people like that had.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about tunnels?
The tunnels are fascinating, and I don't have that in here, and I apologize. I should probably I should rectify that. But the tunnels were a solution to many, many things. So it was a perfect way to move patients, materiel, food, equipment, you name it. Cadavers, unfortunately, that happened. But you could move them without going outside, right? So what they did was they built a system of tunnels. Now the main tunnel, which is about 1/4 mile long, runs from that north branch building, which was demolished in the 70s, down to the south branch building, which was demolished at the same time. Currently, they just have doors at the end of the tunnel. But when you go in there, you can kind of get that vibe that they're from the 1880s. You see the old rounded bricks, and it's really an interesting experience. There are several tunnels, but that's easily the most interesting one.
They're gonna keep those?
If the ones that we might keep are the ones that are completely subterranean. They have steam lines in them currently, but we're putting in geothermal for the lab project, and if we do end up building anything else on campus, it'd be nice to be able to just run piping to the geothermal field, and maybe an existing tunnel might make that, but we'll just have to see. That's beyond my reach, but it is interesting to work with these people. There's a lot of very talented, creative people working on this project, and every time I attend a meeting, I'm just astonished by the level of creativity and talent.
I was told earlier today, I think Fuller told me, that the architect who's in charge of the historic buildings that will stay is John Milner and Associates in Westchester, and they are one of the top historic preservation architects in the United States. They've won all kinds of awards, and they're in charge of these historic buildings that Fuller mentioned. And the architect for the new buildings is Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, is that it?
Yeah.
Out of New York City. One of the top architects in the world for new construction. So the state really is getting the best, both for historic preservation and new construction. And that happens through an architectural selection process. They don't get their job by making political contributions. They're selected by a committee of peers in the architectural profession that review their qualifications and recommend, which architect should get which work. So it's a wonderful process. Another thing I wanted to mention, which we've just been talking about in the last day or two, there's an initiative going on to preserve the Patton Arboretum, which is the arboretum of trees. When you go up there and you see how beautiful that campus is, I mean, it looks like an Ivy League campus because they deliberately planted trees a century ago for a variety of reasons, but over time they made an effort to identify them and preserve them and curate the arboretum of trees as an important element of the state hospital. Do you want to add anything to that, Fuller?
No, that's well said. The reason it's called Patton Arboretum is the director of the farm program for 50 years was a gentleman named Rufus Patton. And he was also involved in the groundskeeping. And he actually compiled a map showing where the different varieties of trees existed. I've seen that map, but I don't have a copy. But one of these days I'll find one. But I thought that was a nice tip of the hat, nice way to honor Mr. Patton. Yeah. And his family is, I believe, in the York area. So very neat.
So it will still be a walkable campus for people to enjoy?
Yes, the green belt will continue. They have an easement right away through Susquehanna Township.
Right.
And then we're planning walking paths that will tie into the green belt at some point.
Okay.
And the public will be encouraged to walk through there. We've had a few conversations about a monument to the state hospital, and we'll continue with those, come up with a design for that. So I think You know, I'm a historic preservation guy. It's always sad to lose buildings. Once they're gone, they're gone. But I think at the tail end of this, I think this will be an asset to the community, and I think people will really enjoy going up and walking through and seeing what's there. And I'm very excited about that.
Any other questions or comments for Fuller?
Yes, you mentioned Camp Curtin. Was there any activity at the hospital during the Civil War that was related at all to the war activities? Or any?
But the answer is yes, if you're basing it on what was state hospital property at that time. Okay, because the state hospital property did go down to where the farm show is today.
Right.
But if you're talking about where the state hospital is today, it's a little bit distant from that.
Yeah, I was wondering more in terms of, I assume any, say, Civil War soldiers who may have become unhinged.
Oh,
so to
excellent
speak.
point. Excellent point. You know, that would be a good research topic for someone. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Now, I did read in an account, and I can't remember anymore what the source was, where the soldiers training at Camp Curtin would go up the hill and get coffee and, you know, and sort of intermingle with the patients and things like that. I thought that was interesting.
And supplies from the farm, didn't they partly supply Camp Curtin?
Absolutely, yeah. yeah.
Farm produce and so forth? No.
What's going to happen to the little houses where she grew up?
Those will probably be demolished.
Will they?
My other house
Using
was
the
demolished
cameras.
too. Was it on Elmerton Avenue? There was a duplex gray stone house. And we lived on one half, and an Italian doctor and his family lived in the other half.
So I remember that house, and what was happening was people were getting into the houses because they were empty. And that's a difficulty with all the empty buildings. You know, the idea of mothballing a building until you can come up with a use for it is an interesting idea, but in practice it's very difficult. And you know, one of our biggest fears is someone would get into an empty house or an empty building and get hurt or you know, worse. So it is a concern.
About a month ago, Fuller arranged for several from Historic Harrisburg to tour many of those buildings, and it was partly to see, you know, what was there and what could be saved and what should be saved and so forth. And there's a company that's going to be doing a lot of the salvaging with their professional salvage operations, so they'll extract anything of value and offer it for sale to the public and so forth. But one of the things that struck us on that tour was the hospital's been closed over 10 years.
Yeah, 2006, yeah.
So almost 20 years.
Yeah.
And in 20 years' time, a lot of deterioration occurs. I mean, you can board it up and you can have police patrolling and everything else, but empty buildings deteriorate very rapidly, and we really saw a lot of stuff that, I mean, could it be restored? Sure, anything can be restored if you've got the will and the way. But from a practical standpoint, many of these buildings, you know, the time to save them was 20 years ago, not now. And a lot of them as dormitories and infirmaries and cafeterias and things like that, you know, those are uses that don't really relate to anything, you know, of a new use that, I mean, that's why Historic Harrisburg didn't object more strongly to all of the demolition. Now, I will say, and I'm hearing from a lot of people that are dismayed about losing what they call the solarium building, because that is a really cool building, and that apparently isn't going to be saved. But maybe the jury isn't completely out on that yet.
The solarium that he refers to is also called Vista Dome. So originally, it was like a rotunda. It had a glass dome, and people could go in there and read a newspaper, relax, get a little sunlight, okay? Now, from a maintenance standpoint, glass domes are very problematic today. Can you imagine what it was like 100 years ago? So eventually they put a metal-clad roof on it, and then in the 1930s, they actually built a frame building inside of that. It's now a 3-story, basically, like, you know, an office farm. So the building is very interesting to look at, but
On the outside.
yeah.
Good point, thank you.
I have a question.
Any other
So-
comments? Somebody back there?
Yeah, just wondering, I mean, it closed in like 2001 or 2006 or whatever, right? But like, it feels, I saw like, I walked around and there were some like COVID-oriented signs, but like all the buildings are locked, so I was just wondering, is that for people who are like policing the buildings, ensuring that people are not entering them? It just was confusing to me trying to figure out.
No, that's a good point. So the state hospital closed in 2006. The Department of General Services, that's who I work for, we took it over, and we were trying to make it into like a second Capitol complex. The idea was to get people out of lease space and put them up at the state hospital grounds. That was mixed success. Some of the DPW offices that were already there were able to stay there, but we were having difficulty getting people interested in coming up there. But that, where you saw those signs might have been the chapel. We used the chapel as a meeting space until the pandemic.
Yeah, the one I think was saying it almost looked like it was like a rehab or something,
Okay.
and some sign.
So, there are two buildings in the front of campus that were leased to Gaudenzia,
Yeah.
and they had alcohol rehab, drug rehab, they had a halfway house. Excellent program, they were great tenants, great neighbors. The Sienna House, the big building, they closed that up in 2019, that was a business decision. And then the Concept 90, they moved out so that we could continue with our preparations for the property.
But then a lot of the buildings, it feels like weren't really like updated since the 70s or something like that, just like kind of architecturally or vibe-wise, or I
Right.
don't know.
That's a good description.
Yeah, so that was just, it was just kind of like left unchanged from then until the 2000s when it was officially closed, or?
Some of the buildings would have been difficult to renovate. So the one I've been taking people in on this round of tours, the Green Building, we go in there because that's where they filmed a lot of scenes for the movie Girl Interrupted. So what you see in that building are these enormously wide hallways. Okay, so if you're not in your patient room, you might be sitting on a chair out in the hallway reading or playing cards with somebody. There's also day rooms that feature prominently in that movie. But the rooms themselves are quite tiny. And it's not a matter of knocking a wall down. These walls seem to be stone. They didn't even try to run utilities through them. They have everything stuck on the wall and along the baseboard. So I think, to your point, I think they just left them to the way they were because it would have been a daunting task to modernize or adapt them.
Anyone else?
I just have like, do you know the patients there, they run the full spectrum from, say, cases of chronic depression all the way to violent?
Absolutely. So you had a lot of people were self-committed, right? So somebody might be having some trouble in their life and might be experiencing depression. You could commit yourself to mental health care. Then there were other people who were violent, not necessarily criminal, but they were mentally ill to the point where they were a danger to others. So there were buildings designed specifically for that. If you walk around the campus, and you are welcome to do that, in the daylight hours, you can see some of the buildings still have bars on the windows. There are buildings that have these wonderful outdoor courtyards with trees and benches. So those would be the violent people, maybe even criminally violent. They'd be able to go outside without having to worry about them running off, right? So you have that center area. So it is interesting to see the different levels of care. Yeah.
So back in the day, when you talk about the chapel and the church there, staff and patients went to church there at the same time. They were so organized that if you're Catholic, you don't eat or drink prior to having communion. They would have the nurses standing beside the priest. The patients would come up, get their communion, and their pill boxes were ready in a line so that the patients could take their medicines after they got communion.
How about that?
Yeah, and they had the patients who were, when you talk about occupational therapy, they had them doing the farming over there. They had a dairy, so we had bread and milk delivered to our home. When they built the laundromat, my mother was one of the first to get diaper service for those of us who were little and in the home. My younger brother was born and brought to his first home on the state hospital grounds.
Wow.
And in the 50s, you'd find all of the psychiatrists that were there were foreigners because it was in the late 50s, other countries were now allowing doctors to come to the U.S. if they took an exchange exam to come here. And the lowest paying specialty was psychiatry. So back in the 50s, if you look up the residents who lived on the grounds, they're all foreign names. There were Filipinos, Czechoslovakian, Italian, but one man, Anderson, one American doctor.
We have an Anderson building, I wonder if it's named after.
I wonder. Well, he lived in the middle house of those 3 homes.
Okay. I met a fellow on Facebook, I think it was, his name's Winterhorn, and they lived in the clapboard house on the corner. I remember when I moved to Harrisburg, I mentioned this to him on Facebook. I remember there was always a million cars sitting around there, and I didn't know what it was, of course. I didn't know that was the state hospital. I just remember that.
And I played as a kid in the one cottage, because that was a house that was given to one of the doctors as well. It was completed as a house. So that was a nice place, beautiful yard and everything there. Good
Fuller, you
memories.
mentioned about people self-committing. The mother of a friend of mine, Philadelphia area, used to commit herself periodically to the Institute in West Philadelphia, the Kirkbride. It's a private facility, but you know, she would just have periods where she couldn't cope, and she would just get into her Cadillac and drive and say, I'm here for a while, and you know, they'd wait on her hand and foot and everything, and oh, you're going to be just fine. And I mean, she wasn't insane, but maybe she was smarter than the rest of us.
Right.
She must have been a mother.
We all need a little help from time to time, right?
One more question.
Yes.
Has anybody within Harrisburg Historical Society or anywhere else made a concerted effort to do photo documentation of all these buildings before they're done?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is yes.
Okay.
So we're working with Commonwealth Media Services. That's a bureau in the Department of General Services about doing some photo documentation. In my source sheet, if anybody's interested, I mentioned early in the presentation that a lot of my information comes from Philip Thomas's wonderful website. He's now moved it to harrisburgstatehospital.com, so it's easy to find. And Phil made it his life's work to photo document the buildings, and hopefully we'll be able to finish that work. So yes, definitely. I think it's worth.
I'm thinking like the 1901 building and a couple of those beautiful facade on the front that's going to be gone.
Right, right. And I also, oh, she's not back here. There was, oh, yeah, there she is. Who did, Chris sent me an email from a fellow from the federal government that was interested in coming up and documenting it, so.
The Department of Interior's.
Department of Interior, right. So that may happen, so that's exciting.
Yeah, we often try to get basically a video obituary of a building that's no longer going to be around, and we've done that for other landmarks around town over time. That and even before the video, just to take a lot of photographs. It's the next best thing when you no longer have the building, and we ask General Services to do that. And Commonwealth Media Services is like state government's Hollywood. They do everything, and they do it very well. So I think this will be a good production.
Yeah, good.
Anything else? Well, thank you all. Thank you again, Fuller, for a wonderful